My son Lucas's quiet cries echoed through the house, fragile and insistent as only a mother can understand. I lifted my head from the kitchen sink, soapy water dripping from my hands, and my eyes immediately found him on the play mat with his grandmother. His little fists were clenched and his lips were trembling, longing for comfort. The sight of his distress sent a shiver through me, an instinctive, primal urge to hold him close and make things better. I headed toward him, my heart pulling me forward. But then my mother-in-law's voice sounded in the room. "Stay away," dear Gloria said, waving her hand dismissively. "You're spoiling him. He needs to learn to cope on his own." I froze, frozen in place, torn between instinct and obedience. The room seemed to shrink, weighed down by my uncertainty. I dropped my hand to my side, swallowing the words that rose in my throat. The air seemed thick, my pulse pounding in my ears as I hesitated. "But he's just a baby," I wanted to say. "He's my baby," but Gloria's eyes were fixed on Lucas, and her lips were pressed into the familiar, unyielding line I'd grown accustomed to. Her gaze was commanding, and it was clear she expected me to obey, as she always had. Ever since Lucas was born, Gloria had been there for me, and her advice felt more like orders. And I, desperate to avoid conflict, had always backed off, letting her take the lead, convincing myself that she only wanted to help. After all, her experience as a mother had to be valuable. But in the back of my mind, every time I backed down, I felt a part of me break, my confidence slipping away. "You're making him too attached," she often said. "He should be comfortable with others, not just you," as if my love could somehow hurt him, as if too much love could make him weak. Those words echoed in my thoughts, making me question my instincts, question whether I was doing the right thing by my son. I remembered the first time Gloria had stepped in to take Lucas from my arms. He was barely a week old, his cries were still so new and unfamiliar. I was exhausted, overcome with sleepless nights and the constant worry that I wasn't doing enough. Gloria took him in her arms, her voice was calm but firm. She was telling me that I needed to rest, that Lucas would do without me for a while. I watched as she rocked him, as his cries gradually quieted, and felt both relief and loss at the same time. It was the beginning of a pattern. Every time I pulled back, I lost a little more of the connection I was trying to make with my son. Lucas's cries turned to quiet sobs, his little body shuddering as he looked around for me. The sight made my heart ache. I wanted to scoop him up in my arms, to hug him, to let him know that I was there for him, that he was safe. The longing in his eyes echoed in my chest. He needed me, and every part of me was screaming for me to go to him. "He'll be fine," Gloria said firmly. "He needs to learn to calm down." I bit my lip and nodded, even though everything inside me was screaming against it. My hands went back to the dishes, but my eyes stayed on Lucas. His sobs were fading, but his tear-filled eyes were still searching for him, tiny hands still reaching for him. I felt powerless, torn between the desire to keep the peace and the overwhelming need to comfort my child. In that moment, something changed inside me. I realized I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't let Gloria's voice drown out my instincts, couldn't let Lucas believe that his screams didn't matter. The realization hit me like a wave. I had to change, for Lucas's sake and for my own. "Gloria," I said quietly but firmly. I turned off the faucet and quickly wiped my hands. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. "I'm going to him." A tense silence followed, which lingered as her eyes narrowed and the rudiments of an argument appeared on her lips. But before she could speak, I moved toward Lucas, and my heart raced as I took him in my arms. It was like breaking invisible chains, the weight of hesitation finally gone. His small body pressed against mine, his head resting on my shoulder. He sighed, releasing the fear and tension all at once. His little hands clutched at my shirt, and I kissed his temple, whispering words of comfort. I felt his body relax, the warmth of his trust enveloping me, and I realized I'd done the right thing. Gloria opened her mouth, but I shook my head, my voice harder. "I'm his mother," I said. "If he needs me, I'll be there for him." Those words gave me strength, as if I'd regained a part of myself that had been lost. She blinked, her eyes widening. For a moment I thought she might object, but then her gaze softened and her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm just thinking," she began, and her voice lost its harshness. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between the need to control the situation and the realization that I might be right. "I know," I said softly. "I know you're trying to help." but I need to do it my way. He needs to know that I'll always be there for him. I held her gaze, wanting her to realize that my love for Lucas was boundless, and that this was exactly what he needed. She looked at Lucas, then back at me, and her expression softened even more. Finally, she nodded, and a faint smile appeared on her face. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, honey," it wasn't an apology, but it was a step forward, a small crack in the wall between us. For the first time, I felt hope that maybe we could find common ground. Later that night, when Lucas finally fell asleep, I found myself sitting across from Gloria at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. I hesitated before I spoke, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had formed between us over the past few months. Gloria sipped her tea, her gaze was detached, and I wondered if she was reflecting on what had happened earlier. "I know it's hard for you to let go," I said softly, breaking the silence. She lifted her head. Her eyes met mine, and I saw surprise in them. "You've been such an important part of Lucas' life, and I'm grateful for everything you've done. But I need you to realize that I need to be the one to comfort him when he needs it. I need to be the one he turns to first." Gloria was silent for a moment, her gaze shifting to the window. "It's just. I remember raising my boys," she said finally, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "I did everything on my own. Their father worked all the time, and I had to be strong, had to make sure they could stand on their own 2 feet. It wasn't easy, but I thought it was the best way to prepare them for the world." I nodded, my heart softening at the vulnerability in her voice. "I understand," I said. "And I know you're trying to help Lucas grow strong. But I also think he needs to feel safe, to know that his mom will always be there for him when he gets scared or upset. That's how he'll learn to be strong, knowing he has a safe place to come back to." Gloria sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Maybe you're right," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I've been too hard on you." And to him she looked up at me, her eyes glittering. "It's just that I love him so much. I want the best for him." "I know," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "And I want you to be a part of his life. I need your help, Gloria. But I also need you to trust me, to trust that I know what's best for my son." She squeezed my hand, her lips curving into a small smile. "I'll try," she said. "I'll really try." Things weren't perfect. And I knew we still had a long way to go. There were disagreements ahead, moments of frustration. But as I held Lucas close to me, feeling his heartbeat, I knew I had taken the first step toward being the mother he needed. I had stood up for him, and for myself, and that was a victory I wouldn't forget. It was enough for the moment. Enough strength to keep going, to keep fighting for my son and our bond. Enough to believe that one day Gloria and I could find a way to work together instead of against each other. Enough to know that my love for Lucas is the one thing I can count on always, no matter what. As the days went by, I began to notice a slight change in Gloria. She watched me more closely, as if reassessing everything she had previously assumed about my ability to be a mother. When Lucas cried, she no longer interceded for him immediately, her hands faltering in indecision, giving me a chance to respond first. It was imperceptible, but I noticed it, and it made my heart feel warmer to know that she was trying, even if she didn't say it outright. One afternoon, while Lucas was napping, Gloria and I sat on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting a golden light on the yard. She talked more about her childhood, about how strict her mother was, how emotions were often ignored in favor of resilience. She talked about the sacrifices she had to make raising her children, and for the first time I felt like I understood her in a new way. The pressures she faced, the weight of raising her boys alone, the need to be both mother and father, all of these things shaped her views on what strength means. "I never wanted my boys to see me as weak," she confessed, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I thought that if I showed them strength, they would learn to be strong too. I didn't realize that maybe sometimes they need me to be gentle." Her vulnerability was disarming, and I reached for her, placing my hand on her arm. "Lucas is lucky to have you," I said, "and I know you love him deeply. I just want him to have the best of both worlds, strength and love, discipline and comfort." She looked at me, her eyes softening, and for the first time I felt the distance between us shrinking. We were two mothers, trying our best, learning from each other. And though the journey ahead would not be without challenges, I finally felt like we were on the same side, working toward the same goal. Later that night, as I put Lucas to bed, I thought about how far we'd come in a short time. I kissed his forehead, watching his eyes close and his breathing slow into the rhythmic rise and fall of sleep. I knew that this journey was just beginning, that motherhood was an ever-evolving journey full of mistakes and triumphs. But as I stood there watching my son, I felt a deep sense of peace. The next morning, as the first rays of light entered the house, I found Gloria already awake and sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She looked up at me and there was a look of understanding on her face that I hadn't noticed before. "Do you want me to make breakfast?" she asked, her voice gentle. It wasn't just a question about food, it was an olive branch, a small way of acknowledging the new dynamic we were trying to build. I smiled and nodded. "That would be lovely, thank you," and as I sat down across from her with Lucas still asleep upstairs, I felt hopeful that we could make this journey together, that we could be the family Lucas needed, with the love and support he deserved. Things weren't perfect, and I knew we still had a long way to go. There were disagreements and moments of frustration ahead. But as I held Lucas close to me, feeling his heartbeat, I knew I had taken the first step to being the mother he needed. I had stood up for him and for myself, and it was a victory I wouldn't forget. It was enough for the moment, enough strength to keep going, to keep fighting for my son and our bond, enough to believe that one day Gloria and I could find a way to work together instead of against each other, enough to know that my love for Lucas was the one thing I could count on always, no matter what. And maybe that was enough for both of us.